Hey guys, what's up? So in this video, this new tutorial series, we're going to be looking at the latest version of Python. And there's multiple reasons why you want to learn Python. It's actually the most taught language in universities around the United States. It's been growing a lot since 1990 when it was first created. Google used it as its primary language for its stack back in the late 90s and early 2000s. They still use a lot of Python. YouTube was originally created in it. So there's still a lot of demand for Python. Right now where it's exploding the most is in data sciences and machine learning. It's considered to be an easier language than a lot of other languages out there. And there's a lot of math libraries for very complex calculations that you can easily tap into if you're trying to learn or do machine learning or anything like that. So Python has a lot of those libraries out there for data scientists. And typically a lot of those jobs do require PhDs or at least masters and or bachelor's degrees, because biologists and physicists and things like that, they would prefer to use Python over something more difficult, probably like C#. But Python is also used all across like servers, so websites are using Python for their stack, like I mentioned, YouTube. Now, as far as like full stack frameworks, Python has frameworks like Django, which Instagram, Pinterest was built on it. And then you have things like Flask, and Flask is now used by a lot of different companies for microservices, for just setting up like a small API. Because these days, a lot of server-side technology is on the less and less, and we're trying to do more and more inside the browser. And that means JavaScript. You're writing a lot of JavaScript that runs inside the browser, but ultimately, where is that data coming from that hits the database and returns data and makes sure that the requests and everything was legit? And that's all server-side code, and Python's a great server-side language for that type of thing. So you'll see that Python really shines in the web development world as well. So Python is considered to be an object-oriented language, although you can procedurally write it. The difference between that is that in object-oriented languages, there are languages like C# and Java that are fully object-oriented, so you cannot write them in a procedural way. Procedural meaning that programs are read top to bottom, left to right, so just like you'd read a book. And obviously you're going to call functions and other files and things like that, but ultimately that's how that execution is working. Now, with object-oriented languages, it's somewhat similar, but there is no everything from the main function of your application. There has to be some sort of class and object stamped from that class to build your application, where Python, you don't have to deal with that. So for a lot of beginners, that might seem confusing to them, but the bottom line is that Python is a very fast language to write, and because of the fact that you don't have to organize your programs, you can write quick Python scripts that just do all kinds of stuff. For instance, so as an example, I'm a C# developer. I write C# code day in and day out. I could have spun up a C# project, like a console application, with a few clicks of a mouse button, but there's quite a bit of boilerplate code with any sort of .NET project. And what I was trying to do is I had a list of files in here that all these different file names are actually the ID of the YouTube video on my channel. So I have it all in here, and I'm like, I need those IDs for the file name. And I need some sort of JSON object so I can iterate through, a list of objects and get that ID. So while I could have wrote it in JavaScript using Node, or I could have used C# or many other languages to do the same thing, I choose Python, even though I've written Python now for 8 years, but I've never actually had a job where I wrote Python for a company, which is, I think it's interesting, but it tells you a lot about, Python as a language itself. It definitely has grown on me. I like it. I use it for little things like this. So one tiny little script, and this is procedurally written code, can read through that list of directories there, and then it's chopping off the last name, and it's building a list of objects there that you end up dumping to JSON format, or serializing it to JSON. And then I put it out in this test.json file, which goes into, let me see. So if I go in here and run the program name, which was build, actually I don't remember what it was called, build videos. And you can see just how quickly that script ran and was executed. And we now have this test.json file. So that's how I was able to generate that JSON object that I ended up putting into, like I said, a constants in ES6, so I could export it around and use that data from within my components and everything. So that's just an example of why Python is just quick and dirty. It's a dynamically interpreted duck type language, so that means by default, like, it is just not going to compete on a speed level with like something like C# or Java, which is compiled. However, the amount of time that it takes you to write something like this to solve a problem like that, like I wrote this in like 5 minutes, so I was able to solve that problem of building that object based on that folder structure. And that's just one particular thing that you could use Python for. There's so many different things, but the speed of being able to do that in Python just it outweighs any sort of performance hits that you might have using Python. Now, because Python is something called a garbage collected language, which means that Python deals with looking for unused variables and things like that, so it does something called garbage collecting, so it frees up memory for memory that was set aside for those variables. Because think, in programming, any sort of variable that you have, it's called a variable because the value can vary. And typically, in most languages, you have types for those variables, right? So there's things called strings and numbers, and we're not going to get into all that because this is not a beginner level programming course. Hopefully you guys know about some of those basics, but the variable can obviously change, and if it can change, then it means that it does take up memory and consumption and things like that for the programming process that is running. So Python automatically cleans that up for you, but any sort of garbage collected language is not going to be as fast as other languages that give you full control over memory management, like C++ or just raw C. But anyway, guys, that's really all I got in this first video. You can use Python for all kinds of different things. We're going to see throughout this tutorial series that we're going to use it for practical purposes. That's the point of this series. Thank you, guys. Bye.